Everyone to our very short seminar on climate risks assessments. So we will show you briefly how they work and how to make it as simple as possible considering it's a climate risk assessment. So who are we? My name is Elisabeth Ignaszak. I am a climate and regulation expert and a freelance sustainability consultant, and I pass over to my colleague Ursula.
Hello, everyone. Good night. Thank you so much for joining. I am Ursula Navarro, and I'm an environmental engineer currently pursuing a PhD in toxicology, and I'm also a consultant in sustainability topics such as life cycle assessment or carbon footprint. And I have worked in different countries as well in Europe, so I have a lot of experience in these topics, and I look forward for having the chance of talking to you more about this topic.
Perfect. So what do we want to talk about today? The agenda is short. Since our seminar is short, we will talk about some key concepts. Then we will talk about the regulatory context. So where do you need the climate risk assessments, in particular considering EU Taxonomy and the CSRD. Then we will go into step by step, what does a climate risk assessment actually look like? And finally, we will show a few examples, tools, methods for the climate risk assessments themselves. And with that, I pass on to Ursula for the first concepts.
All right, thank you. So when we're talking about a climate risk assessment, is basically a process where organizations can assess how they might be affected by different types of hazards that has to do with climate changes, for instance. And we have to understand different concepts. So first, risk is basically the potential for adverse consequences for human or ecological systems, or in this case, organizations. And risk is let's say, the combination of different components such as exposure, which is related to the existence of assets or systems in locations that might be negatively impacted by climate-related hazards. Then we go on hazards, which is basically a potential source of harm. And examples we will look later. But just to mention few would be extreme weather events or sea level rise. And when we're talking about vulnerability, is basically the propensity or predisposition to be adversely affected. And why it's important to measure my climate risk assessment, basically because in this way we can see a potential financial loss due to climate change, and in this case we can improve our resilience as a company. So there are a few examples of risks that can be seen in this table. There are many more types of risk, but just to mention a few, there can be physical risk and also transitional risk. So physical risks are those that are directly provoked by climate change, and these can be measured in terms of time frame. So we have acute risk and chronic risks, and acute risks refer to those short-term effects driven risks that can be caused by extreme weather events such as we have hurricanes or floods, wildfires, and these type of risks can interrupt the whole infrastructure of a company or can affect a supply chain. And we're talking about chronic risks. This basically involve long-term changes in climate patterns. So, for instance, we've heard of ocean acidification or the shifting in precipitation patterns, etc. And these changes can affect impact areas such as agricultural productivity or energy consumption. Many policies are focused in that regard. So for this, we have regulatory types of risks that involve those that are related to laws and regulations, such as carbon pricing or other type of policies that can impact our operational costs, and that might require a shift in our business. And on the other hand, a market type of risk refer to those changes in market demand. So let's say that a company might be affected by a certain type of floods, then this can affect the viability of existing products that our company might be offering. Moving forward, we can see in the European taxonomy, in specifically the Appendix A, it is they classify the hazard types I already mentioned, the chronic and acute, and they give a list of different types of hazards. So we have temperature-related type of hazards, wind-related, water-related, etc. So those we can find in the EU taxonomy.
Yeah, so is it mandatory to perform a climate risk analysis? The answer is maybe. So if you fall under EU taxonomy or CSRD, then the answer might be yes. So in the EU taxonomy, doing a climate risk assessment is both part of the significant contributions for certain activities. If you significantly contribute to climate change adaptation, then you may have to do it. And also, what many people don't realize, if you're trying to do go for EU taxonomy conformity, then in order to prove that you're not doing any significant harm in the goal of climate change adaptation, you also have to do a climate risk assessment. So very likely, if you're trying to reach taxonomy conformity for certain activities in your business, you might have to do a climate risk assessment. And it is also part of the CSRD in the E1, so climate change ESRS standard, the reporting of physical and transition risks and the risk management of these risks is also part of the reporting requirements. So as you can see, if you fall under these regulations, it might be relevant for you.
So, how to perform a climate risk assessment? Of course, this is a very complex and dynamic process, but we can exemplify it in this easy scheme. So first, we have to we are talking about a preparation phase where we have to determine the lifespan of those economy activities that are under the regulations that have been previously mentioned, and we have to identify those, let's say, objects of investigation for our climate risk assessment process, or the specific elements that follow into our operations. So for instance, we have production sites, we have supply chain and logistics, or products and services. The second step will be to identify the potentially relevant climate-related hazards. And we do this by screening the climate-related hazards that we already saw in the Appendix A of the EU taxonomy. And then is the process of conducting the climate risk assessment per se. So for that, we have a distinction for current and future risks. So for the assessment of the current risks, we evaluate climate-related hazards using past climate trends. And if it's available, we can use 10-year climate forecasts or as a substitute for climate projections. And if we want to evaluate the future risks, then we need to use future scenarios, climate projections, and that we can find in the IPCC climate scenarios. And in case of an economy that has a lifespan of less than 10 years, then we don't need to perform future risk and a scenario. But for those activities with a longer lifespan, more than 10 years, we need to do a current and future climate risk based climate projections. So the final step, or let's say like the whole purpose of the climate risk assessment, is to identify, let's say, adaptation solutions, which it's important to identify how we can reduce the risks that might be present in the future or now. So there are certain tools that can make our life easier, of course, because these are all very complex, let's say, processes that can be eased by using tools and models. So for that, we have exemplified simplify certain softwares. I'm just gonna mention a few. So we have Think Hazard, which is basically a tool by the World Bank that allow us to do a screening on climate and disaster risks. And let's say like you can identify the hazards that can affect your company in an easier way. So it's basically a tool for you to like have an organization scheme of the hazards that can be important for your company. We also have Climata, and this in particular represents a climate adaptation tool, and it uses a probabilistic model that allow us to calculate the potential avoided damages in case you perform certain reduction risk plan, for instance.
Yeah, and what does that look like in practice? So there's also a lot of databases that you can use to assess your risk assessments, to assess your sites, whether there is a climate risk. And we thought maybe it's instructive to actually see what that can look like. So what I did is I went to the Climate Adapt database and I just looked at one of the possible hazards, so in this case hot days, and you can see that it's there's different geographies where we can see whether there's fewer or more hot days, and you can also decide which climate model scenario. You see now I picked the higher the more with stronger climate change scenario. You can change what kind of temperature thresholds you would want to see. So this is part of what a climate analysis in detail could look like. So obviously, if you know you're, in this case, working in Spain, you might be more affected by hot days and the resulting effects than maybe in Scandinavia. So this is one example what it could look like for this climate risk analysis. And if you go on the next slide, this is what a result could look like, right? So on the in the rows we have just in this example, right? You have buildings in general, the basement, the indoor facilities, outdoor facilities, whether the water supply is affected, power supply, and so on. And then in terms of the various risks, the hazards, we have heat hazards, storm, flood, and looking at what is the current situation, and in the climate model an optimistic and a pessimistic scenario, and then you analyze, okay, how much does this specific hazard affect you in the various sites, or does it affect your water supply, and so on. And then you can see, green, yellow, red, depending on how deeply you're affected by this particular risk and how high your risk is. Yeah, and with that, we've reached almost the end. So if you have more questions, let us know. Obviously, this was a very brief overview of climate risk assessment. We can go into a lot of more detail, so let us know if you're interested in our services. And for us, for today, we'd be curious if you have any more questions or feedback. We know this was a lot of content in a very short time. So please let us know. And with that, we wish you a lovely evening. And if you want to reach out, you can see our contacts here. Thank you.
Thank you.